So I participated in the 2024 Literary Life Podcast's Reading Challenge, which was Books of Centuries, reading across the span of time, a book or two within every century. How did I do? Well, to be honest, not very well, but the books I did get to were really heavy hitters, so I'm proud of myself, and let's dive into it. Hello friends, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Haley, and I am a Christian wife, homeschooling mother of 3, out to redeem my very own education. And the Literary Life Podcast has been such a blessing to that. They are a podcast that not only talks about great books, but educates you on them as well. They are also Christian, which was a great bonus. And like I said, their podcast has been a blessing. And I found them in December of 2023, so at the very end of the year before last, just in time to find out what their 2024 reading challenge was. And so I had to try to participate. Now, if you watch my channel, you know that I pick a female and male author of the year. And last year that was C.S. Lewis and Jane Austen. So those two authors were my priority reads. I read 13 books by C.S. Lewis, and I read all 6 of Jane Austen's main novels, which certainly fit within certain centuries of this challenge. However, I did want some books to kind of break those up, so I wasn't only reading C.S. Lewis and Jane Austen, even though they're wonderful. And so I decided to participate in this Books of Centuries reading challenge, just to give a little more variety to my reading and try to tackle some of these great books. So let's see how I did. The first century is mythology, and for this I chose Delaire's Book of Greek Myths. I think I read about 5 or 6 of these, and that's it, and I stopped. Not really for any other reason other than I just put it on the back burner and was really enjoying all of my other reads. However, that is a few, and this year my area of study is actually Greek mythology, because reading some of these other great books, I realized, yeah, I really need to educate myself in this area, because so many of the great books reference Greek mythology. So I kind of read a little bit, but I need to revisit these again, definitely. And then the Ancients, I picked a book by Homer, the Odyssey, which I also did not get to. However, like I said, this year my area of study is A Year with the Greeks, and the 2025 Literary Life Podcast Reading Challenge is actually just to pick a reading challenge from their past. So I'm going to continue this with the books I didn't read. And both the Delaire's Greek Myths and the Odyssey will help me in my area of study for Greek mythology. This sounds like I'm starting off really bad, but I promise I did read some books, just in a little bit later centuries. Bible times, I did read my Bible. I do read through a chapter a day at least, so I read several books of the Bible last year, so I can count that. The early Middle Ages, I picked Tales of King Arthur. And I also did not get to this, but it's okay because I read The Chronicles of Narnia last year and lots of other great books. But this is one I kind of want to save, because this year is A Year with the Greeks for me in 2025. But I eventually want to do one for the early Middle Ages. And so I think maybe next year in 2026, I might save it for that. The 14th century, the Divine Comedy. I actually started this. This is the Inferno by Dante Alighieri, and it is the very first book in the Divine Comedy. You have Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, I believe, and this is the first book. It's actually my current read. I'm reading other books alongside this one, but I started it in December. So I started it at the end of the year, which is totally fine. But this is that book that told me I should probably go back and study some Greek mythology because Dante makes so many references to it that if you don't know who they are, it can be a little difficult to grasp the meaning of certain lines. Now, this is an epic poem and it's told in cantos, which are incredibly short, just 2 or 3 or 4 pages. And so I'm just reading a canto a day. I'm currently on canto 18 out of, I'm actually not sure how many cantos that there are. 32, 33, 34, 34 cantos. So I'm working my way through it slowly but surely, which is the way I like to approach books like this. But I did start it at the end of 2024, so that counts, right? The next book I did actually make it through, and I loved it. This was for the 15th century, and that is The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. Now, I used this book as part of my devotional reading every morning because this book is written into 4 parts, and there are all of these little bits and pieces in each book that's about as long as a devotional. So I use this book as part of my devotional reading. This is the first devotional I've ever finished. Not because other devotionals are necessarily bad, but to be honest, a few years into my spiritual maturity, a lot of devotionals really feel like spiritual milk, but this felt like spiritual meat. I annotated the fire out of this. I don't think there was a single section that I didn't highlight or underline or put in my commonplace book. It was that good. And this was written, like I said, in the 15th century. But it was that good, and it was definitely worth the read. The next century was the 16th century, and I did read something from here, and I read A Midsummer Night's Dream by William Shakespeare. And I did actually read it because I have a 2-volume set of the complete works of William Shakespeare, so I thought there's no reason why I shouldn't read it. And I was a little bit intimidated because I hadn't read Shakespeare since high school. However, I had no problems reading it. A Midsummer Night's Dream is the perfect place to start with Shakespeare because it's a comedy. It's very whimsical and fanciful and fun. It doesn't take very long to read, and I loved it. The Literary Life podcast actually has episodes on A Midsummer Night's Dream, so you can read through the acts and then go back and listen to the podcast, because they are going to help you pick up on a lot of things you probably wouldn't have otherwise if you didn't get a degree in literature or English or anything like that, which I did not. So don't let reading great books intimidate you if you didn't study them in college, because I didn't, and I'm enjoying them now just the same. But the next century is the 17th century, and I had 2 books that I wanted to read for this one. The first was Pilgrim's Progress, which I didn't make it to. However, my husband has influenced me to read this immediately when he is done. He is working his way through it right now and absolutely loves it. He says it is so, so good, and the fact that my husband loves it makes me want to pick it up, which I wanted to anyway. Like I said, I was just reading so much Jane Austen and C.S. Lewis that I didn't have time to get to all of these, but that's okay because maybe I will make it to it this year. However, I did, from the 17th century, read Paradise Lost, which is another heavy hitter book. This is another epic poem like the Divine Comedy by Dante, and I loved this book. It took me 6 months to read it. I only read it a little bit at a time, just a little every day, and I was surprised at how much I really enjoyed it. Now, this is another book that does have some Greek mythology references, however, not as much as the Inferno by Dante, so I could read this and still completely understand what was going on based off of the context of the rest of it. But Paradise Lost is essentially a retelling of the creation story, of the Genesis story, of Adam and Eve and the fall of man and Satan tempting them. However, instead, the Bible kind of tells you what happened, But in Paradise Lost, John Milton explores the motives of why it happened or what their thoughts were. So he explores the character of Satan and what happens to make him rise up against God and try to rebel, how he feels about being thrown into hell, what he thinks about Adam and Eve and creation. And his character was so fascinating. Still the enemy, still Satan. I know a lot of people read Paradise Lost and they sympathize with him. I still don't because of some lines in this book. I did a whole video on Paradise Lost after reading it because I was obsessed with it. But I loved the characters of Adam and Eve. This book made them feel so much more normal. I feel more of an ancestral kinship to Adam and Eve after reading this. You know, we can be really hard on them and blame them for all of the sin of the world, but this just made them seem like real people. And I really, really loved it. So if you have never tried this, I highly recommend it. I read a preface to Paradise Lost written by C.S. Lewis before going in because he kind of explains what Milton is trying to do with this epic poem, what he's not trying to do, and it really felt like a defense of Paradise Lost, but also helped me prep myself for the ideas I would meet in here. So if you do pick this up, I would highly recommend A Preface to Paradise Lost by C.S. Lewis. It was great. And so the next century is the 18th century, and I did read from this one. And I read Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Now this is a very interesting edition. I ordered an Everyman's Library edition off of Thrift Books, and you never really know what you're gonna get with thrift books. And so when this came in the mail, I thought, this is not an Everyman's Library edition. This is what I expected it to look like, at least one of those, but I got this instead. However, when I opened it up, it does say Everyman's Library. And if you are a 90s kid and you watched The Page Master as a kid, that is what this is from. So I don't know if someone had this book made, if Everyman's Library did some kind of special edition Page Master books, but that's interesting. But on to the story. You know, I thought Gulliver's Travels was more of a children's story, kind of like a fairy tale of Gulliver meeting all of these strange lands and people, and it kind of is. However, I'm really glad I read it as an adult because there's so much, there's a lot of satire in it, but there's so much he has to say about society and about politics and classes and kings and rulers and thinkers, and just, this was a book that I loved to read it, not because it was really like entertaining or gripping necessarily, but because of how much it made me think. It was very thought-provoking, and so I really, really enjoyed it for that. I thought it had a lot to say about society, even back then in English society, that still applies to modern times today. So this one was a lot of fun. I was kind of dragging my feet a little bit to read it, but I picked it up anyway because it's one that I just wanted to get to, and I'm glad that I did. I'm glad that I did. The next century is the 19th century. And like I said, last year, my female author of the year was Jane Austen. I read all six of her novels. Mansfield Park, of course, other than Pride and Prejudice, was probably my favorite. The Literary Life podcast does have an episode with Mansfield Park that I highly recommend you follow along with if you haven't read that one. But yeah, I read all 6 of Jane Austen's books. However, I didn't just want to write that off as my 19th century because I just wanted to push myself, and I did by reading Middlemarch by George Eliot. This is another heavy hitter, and this is another book that I absolutely loved. I loved this book. Middlemarch is a study in provincial life, and it is a very slow, character-driven read, and I think that's important to know before you pick it up because there's not necessarily a lot of exciting things that happen plot-wise. This is very true to life, true to real life, and that's actually why I loved it. But also, it's a picture of all of these different types of marriages and sort of what makes a marriage a happy marriage, what makes a marriage an unhappy marriage, and I loved it. This is a book that I think I would want my daughters to read before they get married, but there's a lot more it has to say than just marriage. Like I said, it's a study in provincial life. It's a slow read. It's a really beautiful read. It's an interesting read if you like books that kind of focus in on human nature, but I really loved it. It was very, very long, but very worth the time and effort. So if you haven't given Middlemarch a try yet, and you like slower paced reads, and you like books on human nature, you might think about giving Middlemarch a try. And so now into the 20th century. Like I said, I read 13 books written by C.S. Lewis last year. So that is the 20th century books for me. I read all of the Chronicles of Narnia. I read Mere Christianity, the Screw Tape Letters, The Abolition of Man, a Preface to Paradise Lost, a few others. But I really enjoyed his work. I wanted to get to one more book in the 20th century, and I wanted to read The Silver Trumpet by Owen Barfield, which was one of the Inklings along with Lewis and Tolkien. However, I did not get to this one, but I think that this is going to be my next read aloud with my oldest, and I'm really excited about it. I think this is kind of like very fairy tale-esque, and she is 6 years old, and we recently read The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald, and she loved it. I thought it would be a little bit elevated for her. However, it's one of those read-alouds that we've read this past year that has stuck with her the most. So I do think I will give this one a try with her because I think she will love it just as much as I do. So I'm really excited about this one. And then, of course, you have the 21st century, which I read plenty from modern authors. But one I really wanted to get to was Wendell Berry. He is a fiction writer, an essay writer, nonfiction poet from Kentucky. I am also from Kentucky, so I really wanted to pick up Wendell Berry. I didn't know where I wanted to start with him, so I started with his poetry. And I think all of his other fiction works and ideas and what he has to say about life can honestly come from a lot of the ideas that live within his poetry, because they are absolutely beautiful. He talks a lot about nature and about even death, about marriage, mostly about nature and how we should just really live in that present moment and how we should preserve it. He is referred to on the back as the mad ranting farmer because he doesn't like modernity and the encroaching of machines, and he's got some poems about that in there. But I loved these poems, and I think these are going to be a really good look into what's to come whenever I make it to his fiction and some of his essays. And this is another book that I took all year to read through. So in the mornings I would read a chapter from my Bible, I would read one part of a devotion from the Imitation of Christ, and then I would pick this one up and read 1 to 3 poems a day based on their length. But I loved this, and he has an introduction at the beginning about poetry that I loved just as much as his poems. I've been sort of experimenting with writing poems, and I loved what Wendell Berry had to say about writing poetry in the introduction. The poems come incidentally, or they do not come at all. If the muse leaves me alone, I leave her alone. To be quiet, even wordless, in a good place is a better gift than poetry. So this is called This Day Collected and New Sabbath Poems, and I think it was on Sundays Wendell Berry would take his Sabbath walk. So he would just go on a quiet walk through nature, and this is when he would write these poems. But like that says in the introduction, sometimes he wouldn't and sometimes he would. And I really thought that that was a beautiful way to just write poetry and collect it slowly. This is from, let's see, this was over a collection of several years, 1979 to 2013 to be exact. But if you just wrote a few poems every year, you could have a full collection. So that was inspiring to me as an aspiring poet. So we'll see. But if you haven't read this one, I highly recommend it. And then I, of course, read a lot of other modern authors. Sally Clarkson, I read Joy Clarkson's new book, You Are a Tree. I read Sarah Clarkson's new book, Reclaiming Quiet. I read The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, written by Jason Baxter, who is sort of a reoccurring guest on the Literary Life podcast, which was a wonderful insight into the mind of C.S. Lewis, sort of his academic thoughts, what he thought as a medieval professor. And it really, as I was working my way through most of his books last year, it really gave me an insight into where some of those ideas came from. So, I didn't read all of the books that I wanted to get to in the Books of Centuries challenge, but I'm pretty proud with the books I did get to. Like I said, I think they're heavy hitters. And since the Literary Life podcast is letting you pick which old challenge you want to do for 2025, I'm just going to keep going. I have the books on hand that I wanted to read but didn't get to. So I'm going to work on getting to those this next year. And I'll update you all when I do. If you participated in this challenge, please let me know in the comments below what you read, what you wanted to read and didn't get to, and what books you plan on reading in 2025. And I will see you next time. Happy reading!